Micah and Isaiah have particular emphasis for the southern kingdom of Judah. That is where most of their work is done. In fact, those prophecies describe how those prophets were working within the time frame of some of the Judean kings. But both of these prophecies and prophets do speak about what was going to happen with the northern kingdom. And so Micah says, I will make Samaria a heap of ruins in the open country, planting places for a vineyard. I'll pour her stones down into the valley and will lay bare her foundations. All of her idols will be smashed. All of her earnings will be burned with fire. All of her images I will make desolate, for she collected them from a harlot's earnings, and to the earnings of a harlot they will return. Pretty blunt language for how God was viewing the northern kingdom, that is, those tribes that had broken away from the line of David and had been in existence for roughly 200 years. We also talked about how in Isaiah, in his prophecies, also speaks about this, and even in Isaiah 7, the passage we looked at some length regarding Ahaz, that God had even said to Ahaz that, in a short period of time, not only would Syria and Damascus be desolate, but also Samaria. And here God says, the Lord is about to bring on them the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates, even the king of Assyria and all his glory, and he'll rise up over all its channels and go over all its banks. This is what the Lord was going to be doing. And so that's what we're going to look at this morning. We'll spend just a little bit of time looking at how that came about, but 2 Kings 17 spends a whole lot more time talking about the why it came about. And that's where we will devote most of our time as well. So let's go ahead and look at the how. We'll be in here in 2 Kings chapter 17. We'll start in verse 1. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea the son of Elah became king over Israel in Samaria and reigned 9 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, only not as the kings who were before him. I don't know exactly what that means. If you have insight into that, I don't know. Yes?
I think it means that he was evil, but not as evil as the more evil kings who came before him.
I agree with that, yes. And maybe that means he wasn't worshiping Baal. Maybe that means he wasn't, worshiping Molech and these other idols. But, it doesn't specify. Does that mean he was only worshiping the golden calves of Jeroboam and he wasn't doing other things? That's a good possibility. So that is reflected here. Hoshea is not the worst king, but he's still evil. He's not following the Lord with his whole heart. He's not devoted to the ways of Jehovah. And so in verse 3 it talks about Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him, and Hoshea became his servant and paid him tribute. Now, this is not the first Assyrian king that we've read about coming into Israel. Go back to the 15th chapter. And when we were looking at this 30-year period of Israelite history following the death of Jeroboam II, and we noticed all these different kings, and there's assassination after assassination. Well, Assyria had become a dominant force at that time. And they'd become dominant under the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III. And so he factors into this. And in fact, you look in the reign of Pekah, or however you pronounce that. I'll be honest with you. So a little bit of humorous story. Maybe it's humorous. Maybe it's just pathetic. See, I don't know how to pronounce these names, and I'm a little self-conscious about that. You think you're getting it right, and you're like, no idea. This one, every time I say the way I would just normally read it, Pika, as a kid who likes Pokemon, I can only think of Pikachu. Pika, and I don't think that's what it's supposed to be, but whatever. Okay, so we've got this king, Pika. And it says in verse 29 that in his days, this is chapter 15, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and captured Eon, Abel, Beth, Maacah, and Genoa. It goes on to talk about he carries them captive to Assyria. So this is really the second incursion of the Assyrians into Israel. And if you recall, when we talked about how Assyria really exerted its influence over these other nations, if a king was willing to pay tribute, then oftentimes the Assyrians would leave them alone. Okay, so long as that king swears his loyalty, pays tribute. And a previous king had done that. Menahem had done that. Well, now an assassination has happened, a change of dynasty, and so it would seem that this new king of Israel is no longer paying tribute. So that brings in then the second level. Assyria invades, takes territory, takes away captives. And oftentimes what would happen would be the king that had refused to pay tribute was then deposed in favor of another person who would then be loyal to Assyria. It seems that that's probably what happens here too. Because in verse 30 of chapter 15 is when you read that Hoshea, the son of Elah, made a conspiracy against Pekah, the son of Remaliah, and struck him and put him to death. It seems that this is happening at the same time. So Hoshea is probably working with the backing of the Assyrians. There's the tacit approval of, okay, we'll accept this guy. This guy will be loyal to us. He'll pay us tribute. He's an okay ruler over Israel. But he doesn't stay loyal. And so even going back to chapter 17, it says at first, Shalmaneser, this is the next ruler. This is Shalmaneser the fifth. Tiglath-Pileser the third has passed away. Shalmaneser now has come to the throne. And he has to come and basically enforce the vassal state of Israel to render its tribute again. And Hoshea does that for a while. But then he begins to withhold. And why does the text say that Hoshea begins to not send the tribute to Assyria? Who do you think is going to help him? Egypt. We haven't said much about Egypt in this class. Egypt historically is a dominant power. As we've noted before, where Judah and Israel are located, they're right in between these two traditionally dominant areas, Egypt and then, of course, Mesopotamia. Egypt's been pretty quiet. And the history is a little confusing. There's a lot of different dynasties that are ruling at the same time. They're ruling over different parts of Egypt. So it's not a unified country necessarily, or a unified nation. So there's a lot of infighting that's been happening in Egypt, and that's why Egypt's just not vying versus Assyria. But it would seem that there's this one ruler, and I've got some information in the material that we might have identified which king this is. We don't know for sure. But he at least seems to have unified some of Egypt. And so Egypt's a little stronger than they used to be. And so Egypt is maybe beginning to want to exert itself on the world stage again. Or maybe Egypt is just playing tricks on Israel. Egypt knows they cannot vie against the Assyrians, but they'll get Israel to do it, and that kind of keeps the Assyrians occupied, and maybe they'll leave Egypt alone. We don't know. The prophets will oftentimes remark about how foolish God's people were for putting their trust in other nations. Egypt is going to factor in heavily into the fall of Judah when we come to their fall in a few lessons. Well, here, the Israelite king thinks, okay, Egypt is strong, we'll ally with them, which kind of continues this whole theme of Israel's unfaithfulness to Jehovah, their lack of putting faith and trust in the one who would actually be able to give them security and victory over their enemies. Instead, they place their trust in men, they place their trust in Egypt, and at that point, Assyria's had enough. Israel has already rebelled a couple of times, so it's kind of that 3 strikes and you're out. Well, that's how the Assyrians operated. You rebel again, we're done. And so the Assyrians come and they not only take captive They besiege Samaria. It's a 3-year siege. And it's kind of interesting, the text does not go into the horrors of what that would have been like. It doesn't really say just a whole lot about how Assyria became dominant and how they defeated Israel. It just says they did. They take Hoshea captive, they besiege Samaria, and then after the end of 3 years, Samaria capitulates, they are defeated, and Assyria now rules over this entire area. That's the how it happens. Any questions on any of that? Comments? Okay. Let's go to the why, because this is I think by far the more significant thing in what the text is drawing our attention to. So now back in 2 Kings chapter 17, and starting in verse 7, this came about because the sons of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they had feared other gods. Now we date the fall of Samaria to 722 BC. Anyone remember your ballpark figure for when God delivered Israel out of Egypt? Anybody? Around 1400 BC. So we're looking at 700 years after God delivering Israel out of Egypt. Now Samaria has fallen. And yet that's the first thing that's brought up. It says, Israel sinned against the Lord their God who had delivered them out of Egypt, an event that happened 700 years ago. Why do you think the text starts there? Why do we go all the way back to the Exodus? What happened? Well, I'm sorry, Aaron, go ahead.
That was kind of like the beginning of the relationship with God.
Yeah. I think there's even, maybe we're supposed to, there's the map for where the Assyrians came and took them, and I didn't reflect on that. Should have mentioned this. Assyrian practice, which will be different practice from other nations, Assyrian practice was when they took a people captive, they resettled them in other places. And oftentimes they would disperse them. Now, not completely. This will be a little bit different from the Babylonians. The Babylonians will take captive, and it seems will resettle populations generally kind of together. The Persians have an even different method. The Persians are the ones who, to promote loyalty, will allow the people to stay or even go back to places where they have been captive. But the Assyrians resettle people, and what the text talks about, some of those areas, Gozan, Halah, they're in Mesopotamia, so that would be in modern-day Iraq. Others are settled in the cities of Media, that would be modern-day Iran. And so they're dispersed. But let's go back again to clearly what I think is more important, because I even forgot to talk about this part. You go back to where God first brings Israel out of Egypt. And as He brings them to Mount Sinai, and He says, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you'll indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine." I think that's what the writer of Kings is hearkening back to. They sinned against this God. This God who brought them out, delivered them, blessed them, gave them a land. They sinned against this God. This God who said, "You will be my special people. You'll be my treasure if you'll keep my covenant." Now, when you look at Exodus, so much of the rest of the book, and certainly Leviticus, that is the terms of the covenant. That's how these covenant treaties would go. You would have the sovereign who would be speaking to those who are now his people he will rule over, and he will speak of perhaps the blessings that he has for them, or perhaps, for instance, in the case of the Assyrians, here's the might that we exert over you. But then here are the terms, and you are responsible to follow and meet these terms, otherwise there will be grave consequences. Well, here in God's covenant, he begins in those 10 commandments that you read in Exodus chapter 20. That is kind of the broad parameters of the covenant. And what is the very first commandment within the 10 commandments that God says you must not do? You must not worship any other God except for me. That's the start of the covenant. You're going to be my special people. You're going to have my blessings and my benefit. Do not worship any other God except me. Do not make idols. Do not do any of this. And so significantly, as you go through the text here in 2 Kings chapter 17, you start reading of all the ways in which they violated this very first commandment. So it specifies they worshipped on the high places. Now, particularly with what we've read about in Judah, it may be that some of that worship was directed to Jehovah. That's not the only thing that happened on the high places. In fact, the text here in 2 Kings chapter 17 makes mention of that. For instance, in verse 10, where it talks about how they set up for themselves sacred pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And they burned incense on all the high places as the nations did, which the Lord had carried away to exile before them. So that verse is saying this is something that was the Canaanite religion. Just going to a place of elevation, and there you would offer your worship to whatever God, and certainly against God's decree that there was going to be a place where their worship was to be given. A place where he was going to set his name. And so now here the people have just gone to any place, and they're worshiping any and every god. They worship the sacred pillars and the Asherim that are mentioned in verse 10. If I could really do a good Jim Gaffigan impression, I try to make a joke here about, you have all these idols and, maybe some intricately carved idols, and then here's a guy with a pole. There's my guy. Now, I don't know. There's clearly could do better. I don't know why, sacred poles, but this was another feature of their religion. They might be decorated. They may have some, elaborate designs on them, but they would use that to worship a host of gods. There is the worship of the host of heavens in verse 16. Now, that is one that's not figured into our text so far. We've read how Israel worshipped golden calves. We've read how Israel worshipped the Baals. We've read how Israel worshipped the Asherim, how they had these sacred pillars, how they worshipped in the high places. The worship of the heavenly hosts, though, that's not really figured so far. But that certainly has been an aspect of idolatry and false worship, for a long, long time. Why is it that we call certain planets their names to begin with? Because those planets have been, identified and worshipped as gods in times past. That's what nations have done. And certainly the nations that are dominant at this time, Egypt has, for a long, long, long time worshipped the stars of the heavens and the sun in particular. Assyria has worshipped those things. The Chaldees, where Abraham was from, it was a city devoted to the worship of the moon god. So these things have been a factor of false religion for a long time, and they are mentioned here, even though we don't necessarily read about Israel having partaken in that before. Text goes on. They worship Baal. We certainly have seen that. There's the state-sponsored worship under the days of Ahab. But most likely, because Baal had figured into their idolatry at the time of the judges and other times, this is something that the people continued to do. There's a sacrificing of their sons and their daughters. They're causing them to pass through the fire. That would seem to be an indication of the ongoing worship of Molech, the god of the Moabites. And then, of course, there's the worship of Jeroboam's golden calves. And that one is given more attention today, but even in the messages of Hosea and others, yes, God is putting His people away. Does not mean there's not hope for the future. He can bring them back. He still longs for them and desires them. But these are the consequences of God's people departing from Him. Brother Steve also mentioned Judah. That is mentioned in our text as well in verse 19. In verse 18, it talks about how God was very angry with Israel, removed them from His sight. None was left except the tribe of Judah. Also, Judah did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs which Israel had introduced. And we've seen that so far in our story as well. We do have faithful kings of Judah from time to time, but even then we've been noting how the people themselves are not devoted to God. So we will be looking at further Judah and what's going to result there. Shab?
I'm not sure who made the point about Deuteronomy 28. This is a fulfillment of what they said, but I've just been reading through that since they said that. And
Well, you haven't been listening to me? I said some really, really profound things there. Okay.
But you look at the difference between the sections, the blessings for obedience and the curses for disobedience, and you would think that they would have gotten it. Because you look at the blessings, I mean, it's a short 14 verses, and it's pretty the Lord will cause enemies to rise up to be defeated, just basic, God will bless you. But you look at the curses and how vivid it goes, and he talks for the next 45 verses about just how bad things are going to be if they don't listen. And you would think that they just get the memo.
Yeah.
Because it's simple. Follow God. He took care of you. He got you out of captivity. He's provided for you along the way. You lived in places you shouldn't have in the wilderness because you would have died without resources, but He provided those for you. And all you wanted was one simple thing, which is loyalty.
Yep.
And I think that goes for us too. I mean, nowadays He just asks one simple thing: devotion to Him among the world. And we tend to get caught up in those other things, but you just think that it would just be a common thing. But I think when we look at it from our perspective, we make excuses like, oh, well, there's this. It makes it a little bit harder to follow God these days. But I think it's the same here as it was back then.
Yeah, and to a point, as we looked at the prophets will comment on how Israel should have taken note of how bloodied and bruised they were at this point. How much more can you be bruised? How much more can you be, trampled down on? And they didn't get that. And it's as if, it's definitely God is saying, every time I've sent you one of those curses from Deuteronomy chapter 28, that's not just me having wrath, which it is divine wrath, but it's your opportunity to repent. And, likening it to us, I think of Jesus' words in Luke 13. Those who were, questioning, hey, did you hear about the Galileans whose blood was mingled in their sacrifices by Pilate? And not that, Jesus doesn't say, well, that's a definite indication that they were sinners. He just says, you need to repent.
And I think another thing is it's God's proving His trustworthiness. Because at the same time, He fulfilled all of His good promises, but at the same time, He made the promises that if you disobey Me, then the bad promises will come as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well said, Chad. Okay, let's move on to the last part here. So Israel's taken out of God's sight. And so what the last part, verses 24 through the end of the chapter, talks about is how Assyria then resettled Israel. And just show you on the map there, those are the general locations that people were brought out of captive peoples and then brought back into Israel. Now, we will come to know these people as the Samaritans. We won't take time to look at it this morning. They will figure heavily in the stories that are found in Ezra and Nehemiah. As God's people are now coming back into the land, these are, many of them, going to be the opponents to Israel coming back, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding Jerusalem. And then, of course, the animosity that will exist then will only be carried on and amplified as you come to the New Testament and the Jews' hatred for the Samaritans. What the text in 2 Kings deals more with is their worship. So the text talks about how, in verse 25, at the beginning of their living there, they did not fear the Lord. And as a result of that, lions come in, and lions begin to prey upon them, which in itself, harkens back to a curse of the covenant that God had talked about in Leviticus 26. In Leviticus 26, verses 21 and 22, God had said to Israel, if you depart from me, then the beasts of the earth are going to come in and they're going to prey upon you and your livestock. And so here's another people that are now in the land. They don't know who Jehovah God is, and so the beasts of the earth are now preying upon them. So what's the solution here? What do?
They grab a priest to teach them how to worship God. Unfortunately, they grab a priest of unfaithful Israel to teach him how to worship a God he didn't know how to worship. And it's the difference between Reformation and Restoration.
Oh, well said. Yes. Why couldn't... So they get a priest that's been taken into captivity. Why would that not have been a Levitical priest? Who remembers from earlier in our story? Why would that not have been a priest of the tribe of Levi?
Because all of them fled to Judah.
Yeah. After Jeroboam's false institution of false worship, the priests fled Israel and went to Judah. So this is one of those priests of Bethel. In fact, they install him at Bethel. And the text says he teaches them how to serve the Lord. But I think Steve is right. It would have been after the ways of Jeroboam. And not only that, what does the text say about the people that are there? Do they fear God? Yeah.
Seems like they think they do, but they don't.
Yeah. Because they fear God and also... So this is that syncretic worship where like the nations around them, you don't have one God. Yeah, there may be a God of the land of Israel. We'll serve Him and fear Him. But we had gods back in Babylon, and we'll serve them too. And we had gods, from wherever these peoples were brought from. We'll serve them. So we'll serve and fear Jehovah God, but we're going to serve and fear our gods too. And it's interesting, the chapter ends in verses 34 through 41 by commenting on how these people did not fear and worship the God of Jacob. And it's really talking about how God had commanded this from Israel, and God had expected this from Israel, and Israel did not give it, and now these people aren't giving it, and the writer says, and this is true until this day. One of the things that I think he's trying to get across here, and it kind of fits in with this overall chapter, are these people better or worse than Israel? Or are they the same? They're the same. God's people who had had all of His blessings, had been taught in the law, all these things, they feared Jehovah, and they also feared every other god. And so now you have this heathen people that are brought in, and they're doing the same thing. They fear Jehovah, but they're also serving and worshiping every other god on the face of the earth. Israel is no better. Yes, Steve.
Well, and this is evidently written post-captivity, probably by Ezra.
Could be.
Could be. And he's saying, oh, by the way, to this day, post-captivity, they're still idolatrous people. It's why the Jews hate them in the New Testament, and why the woman at the well would say, our fathers worshipped on this
Right.
mountain.
Right.
This shows the disdain developing for these people by God's people.
Yeah. All right. Any other comments or questions? Well, things get a little simpler going forward because we'll not be talking about Israel anymore. We'll only be talking about one kingdom, Judah. Again, the year is about 722. Kingdom divided shortly following the death of Solomon in 931. So we've covered roughly 200 years And we're going to go roughly 100 more years, looking at, well, a little bit longer than that actually, but looking at Judah as they continue in their decline and falling away from Jehovah, and then the punishment that comes on them as well. Thank you, everyone.